Man shares his last meal with a starving bear, but what she brings back will shock you. Daniel sat alone in the vast wilderness, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He hadn't eaten anything substantial in days, and now, he was down to his last scrap of food, a small, stale piece of bread. His stomach growled in protest, the hunger gnawing at him relentlessly. He glanced at the bread, his final meal, and his heart sank. He knew he couldn't survive much longer without food, but he had no choice but to eat it, even if it barely filled the emptiness inside him. The sun was setting, and the shadows from the trees stretched long across the ground. The cold evening air was starting to bite at his skin, and the forest, once peaceful, now felt like a vast, empty place. Daniel had been stranded in this remote area for days, and his chances of making it through the night without food were slim. Still, he held on to a small glimmer of hope. He had to. With trembling hands, Daniel broke off a small piece of the bread and took a bite. It was dry and tasteless, but it was all he had. As he chewed slowly, his mind wandered. He thought of home, of people who cared about him, of the life he had left behind. But none of those thoughts mattered now. All that mattered was survival. Just then, a rustling sound from the nearby bushes made him freeze. His heart skipped a beat as he looked around, trying to figure out what was making the noise. Was it another human? Or perhaps an animal? The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he strained his ears to hear better. Suddenly, out of the shadows, a large figure emerged. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he saw a bear stumbling toward him, its head lowered as it sniffed the air. The bear was thin, its fur matted and dirty, its ribs clearly visible. It looked weak and desperate, its movements slow and deliberate. The bear was starving. As the animal drew closer, Daniel's pulse raced. He had heard stories of bears becoming dangerous when they were hungry, but this one didn't seem threatening, just tired and hungry, like him. The bear's eyes met Daniel's, and for a brief moment, they shared a silent understanding. Both were in a battle for survival. Both were looking for anything to ease the pain of hunger. Daniel's heart pounded as the bear moved closer, its gaze fixed on the last piece of bread in his hand. It was clear that the bear had found its prey. But the question was, would Daniel keep the food for himself, or would he risk giving it to the starving creature before him? The tension in the air was thick, and Daniel was faced with an impossible choice. His survival instincts screamed at him to hold on to the bread, to keep it for himself. But something in the bear's eyes made him pause. Was this the moment where he would put his own survival second, or would he share what little he had left with the animal in front of him? The bread felt heavy in Daniel's hand, more than just food. This small piece of stale bread represented his last hope. His stomach growled painfully, a constant reminder of how little he had left. He could almost feel his body weakening with each passing hour, and the thought of going hungry any longer seemed unbearable. The forest was eerily quiet now, and it was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. In front of him stood the bear, a creature, just like him, in desperate need of sustenance. Daniel's heart raced as he looked at the bear's thin frame, its ribs visible under its matted fur. The bear, too, was struggling. The sight of the animal's desperate eyes mirrored his own hunger. But while Daniel could still hold on for a little longer, the bear seemed like it was on the brink of collapse. He was stuck, torn between two instincts that were pulling him in opposite directions: survival and kindness. Every fiber of his being told him to keep the bread. It was the only thing he had left to keep him going. If he gave it to the bear, what would he do tomorrow? What if he didn't survive the night? What if sharing his food meant he wouldn't make it out of the wilderness? His mind raced, spinning with all the possibilities of what could go wrong. But there was another part of him, a quieter voice deep inside, that kept saying, what if? What if the bear could help him in return? What if, by showing kindness, he could create an unspoken bond with this wild creature? It was a risky thought, but there was a strange feeling stirring within him, an urge to do something selfless, to share with the bear as he had no one else to share with. His fingers tightened around the bread, and he hesitated. For a few moments, he simply stared at the bear, wondering what would happen if he chose kindness over survival. The bear, too, was waiting, its eyes locked with his, silently pleading for help. Time seemed to stretch out in that quiet moment, each second heavier than the last. The rustling of the trees in the gentle wind was the only sound that filled the space between them. Daniel's breath slowed, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. It was a strange feeling, one that didn't make sense in the wilderness, where only the fittest survive. But somehow, deep down, Daniel knew he wasn't just dealing with a wild animal anymore. This was a shared struggle for survival, a bond that transcended hunger, a connection that didn't need words. The decision was still excruciatingly difficult, but in his heart, Daniel knew what he had to do. He slowly extended his hand, offering the last bit of bread to the bear. His hand shook with uncertainty, but his resolve grew stronger with each passing second. He had nothing to lose, but in this moment it wasn't about surviving for himself. It was about doing what felt right, about extending a hand to another creature who was suffering just as he was. The bear sniffed the air, then cautiously stepped forward, its nose twitching as it got closer to the bread. Daniel watched, hardly daring to breathe. For a moment, the bear paused, its gaze never leaving Daniel's face, as if trying to understand his intention. Then, with a tentative motion, the bear reached out and took the bread from his hand. It chewed slowly, almost reverently, as if savoring the small meal that Daniel had offered. Daniel couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over him. The weight of the decision lifted, replaced by an unexpected warmth in his chest. He had done something selfless, something that went against every survival instinct he had. And yet, in that moment, it felt like the right thing to do. The bear finished the bread quickly, looking up at Daniel with a quiet, almost grateful expression in its eyes. Daniel didn't know what it meant or what would happen next. He wasn't sure if sharing that bread would change anything. But he knew one thing for certain. He had chosen kindness, and somehow that made the wilderness seem a little less lonely. It was a simple act of giving, but it felt like a powerful, life-changing moment. The air around them felt different now, charged with something unspoken. The bear had taken the bread, and Daniel had chosen to believe that in this vast wilderness, even in the darkest hours, there was room for compassion. For the first time in days, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Whatever happened next, he knew that he had made the right choice. The wilderness, harsh and unforgiving, had become a place of unexpected connection. A place where even a starving man and a bear could share something that went beyond survival. As soon as the bear finished the last crumbs of bread, it paused, its eyes still fixed on Daniel. For a long moment, there was no movement, only the quiet sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Daniel held his breath, not sure what to expect. Had he made the right choice? Had the bear's actions been a simple act of hunger? Or was there something more? To his surprise, the bear didn't rush off or turn away. Instead, it stood there for a few moments longer, still gazing at him with an expression that seemed almost peaceful. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He was used to seeing wild animals react out of instinct, aggression, fear, or the need to survive. But the bear wasn't acting aggressively. It wasn't rushing to find more food. It wasn't showing any signs of hostility at all. Instead, the bear just stood there, breathing heavily, its chest rising and falling as it took in the air. For a moment, it seemed as if the bear was taking in more than just the food. It was processing something deeper, something unspoken. It was as if the bear understood, in some deep primal way, that this act of kindness, this unexpected gift, had shifted the balance between them. Daniel wasn't just a stranger in the wilderness. He was someone who had chosen compassion over self-preservation, someone who had shared his last resource with the bear, despite the risk. Daniel's eyes met the bear's, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he felt as though the two of them shared a mutual understanding. The bear was still hungry, yes, but there was a gratitude in its gaze, an acknowledgement of something beyond the simple exchange of food. It was an unspoken thank you. It was the bear's way of recognizing that, for once, someone had put kindness above all else. With a soft grunt, the bear slowly backed away. Its movements were no longer frantic or desperate, There was no urgency in its retreat. It wasn't running off into the forest to look for more food or to escape danger. Instead, the bear turned, pausing to glance back at Daniel one last time before disappearing into the woods. Daniel exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath. The weight in his chest had lifted, and he felt a strange sense of peace settle in the pit of his stomach. The encounter had left him both drained and strangely uplifted, as though the small act of sharing had bonded them in a way that words could never describe. Daniel sat there in stunned silence, still processing what had just happened. The bear was gone now, swallowed up by the vast expanse of the forest, but the impact of the encounter remained. His body still ached from hunger, and the harsh reality of the wilderness hadn't changed. But something deep inside him had shifted. The forest, which had felt so isolating and cold just hours ago, now seemed less indifferent, less hostile. There was something more in the air, an unspoken connection that had been forged between two beings who, against all odds, had shared a moment of kindness. For the first time since he'd been stranded in the wilderness, Daniel felt like he wasn't alone. The bear's unexpected acknowledgement, its silent thank you, had filled him with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in days. And though he didn't know what would happen next, he felt a renewed sense of strength within himself. The encounter had reminded him that even in the most desperate situations, even when it seemed like all hope was lost, there was room for compassion, for connection. As Daniel sat there in the stillness of the forest, he realized that the bear had given him something far more valuable than food. It had reminded him of his humanity, of the importance of kindness, even in the face of extreme hardship. Hours passed, and the sky darkened further, but Daniel felt a sense of calm he hadn't known before. The wilderness, once a terrifying, empty place, now felt full of life, full of possibility. The bear, in its quiet, powerful way, had reminded him that survival wasn't just about the physical fight for life. It was also about the emotional strength to do the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. It was about seeing beyond one's own suffering and recognizing the suffering in others. And in that moment, Daniel knew that even though the bear had disappeared into the forest, the connection they had shared would stay with him forever. The wilderness hadn't taken everything from him. It had given him a gift, one that, perhaps, would guide him through the rest of his journey. Daniel stood there, barely able to believe what had just happened. The bear had come, shared his last meal, and then, it simply disappeared back into the forest. The wilderness around him, which had once felt like a hostile, unforgiving place, now seemed oddly quiet, almost serene. The sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls, had returned, but there was a new tension hanging in the air. It was as if something had shifted, but Daniel couldn't quite put his finger on it. He looked down at the empty spot where the bread had been just moments ago. The crumbs scattered on the ground were all that remained of the exchange. For a brief moment he felt a sense of peace. Had the bear been satisfied? Was this really the end of the encounter? But before he could truly absorb what had happened, something made him stop. A sudden rustle in the underbrush caught his attention. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He froze, straining his ears to listen. The sounds from the forest had changed again. More urgent, like the wind shifting in a way that suggested something important was about to happen. The rustling grew louder. Daniel's thoughts raced, and a knot tightened in his stomach. Could it be the bear? Had it forgotten something? Was it coming back for more food? Or was there something else in the forest? He instinctively took a step back, not knowing what to expect. The tension in the air was thick. His mind was in overdrive, weighing every possible scenario. What if the bear hadn't left for good? What if it had sensed something in him, something that made it come back? Then, out of the shadows, the bear emerged once again, its large figure moving with an almost eerie calm. Daniel's breath caught in his chest, his heart pounding in his ears. The bear's gaze was fixed on him once more, its powerful body stepping carefully through the underbrush. For a moment, it seemed like the bear was studying him, its eyes reflecting something Daniel couldn't quite understand. Was it curiosity, caution, or something deeper, more profound? But before Daniel could fully comprehend what was happening, the bear did something that took him completely by surprise. Without warning, it turned and bolted back into the forest. Just like that, it was gone again, swallowed by the shadows of the trees, leaving Daniel standing there in stunned silence. The suddenness of the departure left him frozen in place. It didn't make sense. What had just happened? His mind struggled to keep up with the rapid pace of events. The bear had appeared, taken the food, and acknowledged him in that silent way. But now it was gone, without a word, without a hint of explanation. Daniel remained standing there, his breath still shallow, his heart racing. The forest, once so full of chaos and fear, now seemed eerily silent, almost too quiet. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each question leading to another. Why had the bear returned? Why had it left again so quickly? There was something unsettling about it all. He had shared his last meal with this wild creature, and in return, it had shown him what seemed like gratitude, an acknowledgement of his selflessness. But now, with the bear gone, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the encounter than he realized. What if the bear wasn't finished with him yet? A wave of doubt washed over him. What if the bear's departure wasn't just a coincidence? What if it had come back for a reason that Daniel didn't understand? His mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of everything. He couldn't help but feel that something bigger was unfolding, something that was beyond his control. The tension in the air had shifted once again, and he wasn't sure if it was relief or something more ominous. The wilderness around him, which had once seemed so vast and impersonal, now felt almost alive, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Daniel glanced around, half expecting the bear to reappear at any moment, or for some new threat to emerge from the shadows. The quiet felt unnatural, and the stillness only deepened his sense of unease. As he stood there, contemplating the encounter, he couldn't help but wonder, had the bear left because it was afraid of him? Or had it sensed something more in the forest that made it retreat? There were so many unknowns now, so many unanswered questions that seemed to loom over him like a dark cloud. Despite the bear's departure, Daniel didn't feel entirely alone. The connection they had shared, the brief moment of compassion, was still fresh in his mind, but now it seemed clouded by uncertainty. Had he made the right choice? Was it the bear's way of thanking him? Or was there something he had missed? The feeling of doubt lingered, gnawing at him, growing with each passing minute. It was almost as if the bear's actions had planted a seed in his mind, one that was now growing into a nagging thought. What would happen next? Would the bear return again? And if it did, what would that mean for him? As the last traces of daylight began to fade and the forest grew darker, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something. What started as a simple act of kindness had turned into an unpredictable and mysterious encounter. The questions, the doubts, the uncertainty, they all weighed heavily on him. But deep down, Daniel knew one thing. Whatever was happening wasn't over. The wilderness was full of surprises, and it had already shown him that things weren't always as they seemed. In the distance, the forest seemed to whisper. It was almost as if the wind was carrying the answer to the questions that hung in the air. Daniel could only wait. The bear had gone, but something told him that the story wasn't finished. Not yet. It had been several days since the bear's sudden departure, and the wilderness had returned to its usual rhythms. Daniel had tried to push the strange encounter from his mind, telling himself it was just a fleeting moment of connection with nature. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Every time he ventured into the forest, his eyes would scan the trees, half expecting to see the bear's massive shape emerge from the shadows. But it never happened. Then, one crisp morning, when the sun was just beginning to rise and cast long, soft shadows across the forest floor, Daniel found himself back at the same spot where it had all started. The air was cool, and the silence of the woods seemed thicker than usual. As he stood there, staring into the distance, the feeling that something extraordinary was about to unfold gripped him once again. He turned around, preparing to leave, when he heard it, a soft rustling in the underbrush. His heart skipped a beat, and he froze in place. Was it the wind? Or had something caught his attention? And then out of the trees appeared the bear. This time, it wasn't just a brief glimpse or a shadow fading into the distance. No, this was real. The bear stepped forward, its massive form moving with a calm purpose, as though it had been searching for him all along. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was the same bear, the one he had shared his last meal with. But this time, there was no fear, no hesitation in its movements. The bear seemed different. Its eyes locked onto Daniel's with a quiet intensity, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to fade away. Daniel stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His mind raced, trying to process the unexpected turn of events. The bear was back. But why? Was it simply lost or curious? Or was it returning for something else entirely? Before he could form any more thoughts, the bear slowly advanced toward him, its steps deliberate and calm. And then, it stopped just a few feet away from him. The air between them felt charged, as if something monumental was about to happen. Without warning, the bear lowered its head slightly and then did something that left Daniel speechless. It gently pushed something forward with its snout. Something small, shiny, and unexpected. Daniel's eyes widened as he looked down to see what the bear had brought him. There, resting in the soft earth, was a small bundle of wildflowers, carefully arranged in a way that looked almost deliberate. They were simple, delicate flowers, bright yellow and soft purple petals blending together in a quiet, beautiful display. Daniel reached down slowly, unsure if he was seeing things correctly. He picked up the flowers, turning them over in his hands, feeling the soft petals between his fingers. They had been carefully chosen, almost as though the bear had intentionally selected them, and the gesture was unlike anything Daniel had ever imagined. The bear, having delivered its unexpected gift, didn't linger. After a brief pause, it turned and began to walk away, its massive body retreating back into the trees. But this time, the bear didn't just disappear into the wilderness. It looked back once, as if checking to see if Daniel had understood. Daniel stood there, holding the wildflowers, his mind spinning. The bear had come back, not for food, not for anything other than to give him a gift. The magnitude of the moment hit him all at once, leaving him in awe of the animal's actions. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you for his selflessness and kindness. The bear had returned to repay him, not with a grand gesture, but with something so simple, yet so profound. The flowers were a symbol of the wild, a reminder of the unexpected beauty that could come from even the harshest of circumstances. And in that moment, Daniel understood. The bear's gift wasn't just about the flowers. It was a message, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could create ripples in the world, even in the most unexpected of places. As Daniel stood there, watching the bear's silhouette disappear into the forest once again, he felt a profound sense of peace. The forest had given him something he couldn't have anticipated, something more valuable than food or survival. It had given him a moment of connection, a gift that would stay with him forever. The encounter with the bear had changed him. It had taught him the true meaning of gratitude, not as a simple gesture, but as a deep, unspoken bond between all living things. The bear's return had reminded him that sometimes the most powerful gifts don't come in the form of material things. They come in the form of understanding, of shared moments, and of kindness returned in ways we could never expect. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting its light on the wildflowers in Daniel's hands, he couldn't help but feel grateful for everything that had unfolded. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. The world was full of mysteries, full of gifts, and sometimes they came in the most unexpected forms. As Daniel walked back home, the wildflowers still clutched gently in his hands. He couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. His mind was racing, but it was no longer with fear or doubt. It was filled with a profound sense of wonder. How could something so simple, a bear bringing a small bundle of flowers, carry such a powerful message? He had always known that kindness was important, but the events of the past few days had brought him face to face with a deeper truth. The bear hadn't just returned to offer a gift. It had returned to show him the true power of kindness. It was a reminder that even in a world where survival often came first, the simplest acts of compassion could have a profound impact. Daniel had given the bear a meal not out of obligation, but out of genuine kindness. In the midst of his own struggles and doubts, he had chosen to share what he had without expecting anything in return. He didn't know why he had done it, but in that moment he had listened to his heart. And now that simple act of kindness had come back to him in a way he could never have imagined. The bear's return wasn't just about the flowers. It was about the unspoken bond that had formed between them. It was as if the bear had sensed something in Daniel that had been awakened through their brief encounter. The wildflowers, small and simple though they were, carried with them the weight of that connection. They were a symbol of the fact that kindness, once given, can create ripples that transcend time and space. Daniel thought about the bear's gesture, reflecting on how it had transcended the boundaries of human and animal. It was a reminder that kindness is universal, something that all living creatures can share, no matter how different they may seem. In a world where everything often felt transactional, where people gave only to receive, it had become easy to forget that sometimes the most powerful gifts are the ones we give without expecting anything in return. As he reached his cabin and set the wildflowers down on the windowsill, Daniel felt different. It wasn't just the sense of wonder that lingered in his chest. No, it was something much deeper. The bear's return had left an indelible mark on him, one that would stay with him long after the encounter had ended. Daniel had been a man who struggled with isolation, with the harsh realities of living alone in the wilderness. He had learned to rely on his own instincts, trusting no one but himself. But now, as he stood there, reflecting on what had happened, he realized how much he had been missing. For the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the bear, but to everything around him. The trees, the wind, the animals that roamed the forest. They weren't just things to be observed from a distance. They were part of a larger, interconnected world, one that thrived on kindness, compassion, and reciprocity. In the past, Daniel had kept his distance from the world, afraid to open his heart to others. He had been consumed by the need for survival, for protection, for self-preservation. But the bear's return had reminded him that there was more to life than just getting by. It was about living with purpose, about sharing with others, even when you had nothing to give. It was about recognizing the beauty in the small moments, in the connections that are formed without words or expectations. As Daniel stood in the quiet of his cabin, the wildflowers still blooming on his windowsill, he couldn't help but smile. He had been changed. The encounter with the bear had opened his heart in ways he hadn't thought possible. He now understood that kindness wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a force, a gift that could change lives, both his and the lives of those around him. The bear had shown him that even in the wildest, most unpredictable places, there was room for tenderness, for compassion, and for grace. It was a lesson he would carry with him always, a lesson that would shape his future and the way he saw the world. From that day forward, Daniel would never forget the incredible gift that had been given to him. Not the flowers, not the meal, but the deeper understanding that kindness, once shared, has the power to transform lives in the most unexpected ways. As the days passed, the memory of the bear's visit continued to resonate deeply within Daniel's heart. The wildflowers, now carefully pressed and framed, stood as a constant reminder of the profound connection they had shared. It wasn't just a moment in time. It had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his daily life. The once solitary man, who had lived for years in isolation, had now discovered a truth that transcended survival. He had been reminded that kindness, no matter how small, could come back in ways that were beyond comprehension. What he had given so freely to the bear, a simple meal, had been returned to him in a form that was so unexpected, yet so fitting, a gift of gratitude. Looking back on that day, Daniel understood that the bear's return wasn't just about the gift of wildflowers. It was a manifestation of a deeper, universal law of nature. In a world where it often felt like everyone was taking and little was given in return, he had witnessed firsthand the power of reciprocity. It was a cycle: what we give, we receive. The kindness we put out into the world, no matter how small, can ripple outward and return to us when we least expect it, often in the most beautiful ways. For Daniel, the journey had come full circle. He had started as a man just trying to survive in the wilderness, unsure of the impact of his actions. But now, he understood that true survival wasn't just about the basics. It was about relationships, about the unseen threads that connect all living beings. He had experienced the quiet but powerful force of reciprocity, and it had forever changed him. As Daniel continued to reflect on his incredible experience, he couldn't help but feel a strong urge to share his story with others. In a world that often feels disconnected and divided, this story of an unexpected encounter between a man and a bear was a reminder that kindness has the power to heal and unite, even across the boundaries of species. If there's one thing Daniel hoped people would take away from his story, it's that no act of kindness is ever too small to make a difference. Whether it's offering a meal to a hungry animal, helping a stranger in need, or simply lending a kind word when someone needs it most, the power of compassion is limitless. Just like Daniel and the bear, we all have the ability to make a difference in the world around us. So, next time you have the chance to show kindness, don't hesitate. You never know how your actions might come back to you, or how they might change someone's life. If you've been touched by this story and believe in the power of kindness, we invite you to share it with others. Let's keep this message of reciprocity alive. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know how kindness has touched your life. And remember, kindness is never wasted. It always comes back when you least expect it.